Now, every person in this room today will be impacted by climate change and biodiversity loss. Whoever you are, whatever your position, everybody is going to be impacted. But the good news is that each of you also have the power to make a difference. Those of us working in the financial sector, actors in the corporate and financial world, can help individually and collectively to transform our economies, to drive the transition that is so needed. The question that I want to ask is, what are you going to do? What action are you going to take? Now, I want to spend these few minutes that have been allocated to me this afternoon to reflect on the progress that's been made, to actually acknowledge some of the hurdles that we face, to highlight some of the work that ClientEarth has been involved in, and to talk about a couple of legal developments that you may not be aware of. Hopefully, that will actually provide you with some ideas, some inspiration, and at the end of the day, you'll be thinking, yeah, I can actually do something. There is something that I can do to be a force for good. So what is it, the challenge that we face? Now, nearly 8 years have passed since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2015. At that time, there was the consensus from the global community that we needed to act to keep global temperature rise below 2 degrees and to work to keep temperature rise below 1.5 degrees. But how have things been going? Well, we can all see the climate impact, can't we? The impact on some communities is absolutely devastating. And none of us can help but notice the increase in rain, the higher temperatures. I mean, here we are in October, and it's just really warm. There are more wildfires, there's increased intensity of storms as every year passes, and we keep breaking more records. And I hardly need say to the audience here about the financial impact of those climate change impacts that we're having. Think about the insurance payouts. These impacts, these financial impacts, are going to be felt by future generations, and that should be making us think. So what has been happening to tackle these challenges at the systemic level? Well, I think there's been a lot of progress. We can probably pat ourselves on the back a little bit. There's been new laws, there's been new regulations, and there's been behavioural changes. There's been a lot of talking. There's been increase in knowledge and understanding of the issue, and huge numbers of pledges and promises, but there remains an urgent need for transformative action. The new chair of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Jim Skewer, said this week, the key thing in terms of global warming is not the timing of net zero, but the pathway by which we get there. Professor Skewer went on to explain that if you put off the action, you find that warming will be larger than it would have been otherwise. If we put off decarbonisation, it will result in a hotter atmosphere, making the net zero goal harder to achieve. So we need to take action now, and we can't afford further delay. Now, I hope the fact that you're here today is an indication that you see that need for action. You've heard a lot today, I think, about regulatory developments, on using stewardship tools, on circular economy, and on investing for impact. I'm sorry I haven't been here to listen to all of that. I see my role here today to come back up from that deep dive into the technical detail to let's come back up to the surface for a moment. Let's breathe, let's remind ourselves of the goal, and think about where we've reached on the journey, and I want to encourage you to keep going, to push harder and faster. Now, before I move on, I want to spend a few moments to introduce ClientEarth to you, just in case you're not familiar with us and what we do. So ClientEarth is a legal, not-for-profit environmental organisation. We use legal strategies to deal with the big environmental issues of our time: climate change, nature loss, pollution. We are working towards a healthy planet where nature and people thrive together. We use the legal levers available in current laws. That might be laws relating to disclosure or management of risk, duties of directors, or fiduciaries. We help shape future laws, and where appropriate, we enforce the law by bringing legal cases against governments, companies, and others. We look at the issues across the systems and sectors that we see as fundamental to tackling the climate, biodiversity, and pollution crises. Extracting and burning fossil fuels, that's coal, oil, and gas, is the largest source of global greenhouse gas emissions driving climate change. Burning fossil fuel is also one of the largest sources of air pollution globally. To reduce global emissions, it is essential that we improve industrial energy efficiency and shift our energy sources away from fossil fuels towards climate-neutral sources, but making sure that they don't have a negative impact on biodiversity and people. So we're looking at the energy, transport, and materials systems, but we're also looking at the food system. Food production is the biggest user of land and is responsible for 1/4 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions. The biggest threats to wildlife globally are overexploitation, including fishing, and agriculture, including crop farming and livestock farming. Half the world's habitable land is used for agriculture, and agriculture accounts for 70 to 80% of tropical deforestation. And given that I'm speaking here in the City of London, and I'm a city lawyer by background, I want to highlight too the financial and economic system, and I'll be talking a little bit more about some of those aspects in a moment. But first, I promised a moment of reflection on the progress that has been made, and I want to pepper that with a few examples of ClientEarth's work. So I've been working in this space for nearly 6 years, and in that time I've witnessed a significant shift in awareness and understanding of the environmental issues that are relevant to corporate and financial world. And I include in that the world of pensions and investment. So back in 2017, despite Mark Carney and as the then Governor of the Bank of England clearly setting out the financial and economic risks associated with climate change, many people considered environmental issues as ethical issues, and nice to have, but not something that fiduciaries should look at. Thankfully, climate change and increasingly biodiversity risk is now understood to be the material financial risk that it is, and it needs to be considered alongside all other financial risks. We've seen climate and biodiversity issues looked at through that lens of risk. What are the risks to my business? What is the risk to my investments? How might those risks impact my business plan, my profitability, my product lines? Have those risks been factored into asset values? Is there a risk of stranded assets? We're all familiar with these things. Well, back in 2018, ClientEarth lawyers brought a legal challenge as shareholders in Polish energy company Enea on the very issue of financial risk. That challenge was the first case on climate-related financial risk, and it was in relation to the company's decision to push ahead with a controversial coal power plant despite the concerns that it would never be financially viable. That challenge was successful, and after the Polish court ruled that investment decisions had been invalid, the companies behind the coal plant pulled the financing. At ClientEarth, we've made various complaints to regulators where we found corporate disclosures to be inadequate. Those complaints have invariably led to improved disclosure the following year, and provided opportunities for us to talk to the regulators. And now, obviously, we've seen new requirements about disclosing climate-related risks, which clarify or supplement those obligations there were anyway to think about principal risks. But disclosure and investment exclusion and those sort of things alone cannot solve the problem. So following and beyond that drive for increased transparency, we at ClientEarth have been instrumental in leading and amplifying calls for proper management of risk and preparation of transition plans. Transition plans are crucial, but they need to be meaningful. There needs to be accountability for failing to meet them. And of course, they need actually to be implemented and actions under them reported upon. So there's been some positive movement. But alongside that, with the advent of this increased awareness at consumer level, we've seen that growth in companies trying to capture the narrative that they are green, that they're part of the solution, that they want the competitive advantage by making all sorts of green, environmental, carbon neutral claims. So that's led to an important stream of work for us as we have sought to prohibit companies from making vague claims about environmental performance. And we want to put an end to that misleading advertising. Some of you may recall the advertisements that were in 2019 from BP. Possibilities everywhere. Keep advancing, they said. We lodged a complaint about those because those ads, in our view, misled the public. They focused on BP's low-carbon energy products, suggesting perhaps that it was changing its business and racing to renewables. But the reality was that more than 96% of BP's annual spend was on oil and gas. The ads were withdrawn. Continuing on the greenwashing theme, we've more recently, together with partners, brought a claim against Dutch airline KLM. I don't know whether you've seen their advertisements, Fly Responsibly. It promotes the sustainability of flying and suggests that it is tackling climate change, but we know that its plan is to grow its business. There's a lot of carbon offset marketing by KLM. It suggests that customers can reduce the impact of their flight by supporting a reforestation project. Now, that project may be great, and I've got no concerns about those sort of projects, but making a payment to that project of £5 or whatever does not in any way compensate for the carbon emissions of that flight. There is no correlation. And there's a danger with offset marketing that businesses just don't do what they really need to do, which is reduce their carbon emissions. And then returning to the oil and gas companies, with partners, we're actually also bringing some action against Total Energies in connection with their rebrand. Energy reinvents itself. The company says it is on track to be carbon neutral by 2050, but it is still promoting and selling more fossil fuels. How can those statements be consistent? So I've mentioned a few cases, and the rate of climate and environmental-based litigation is growing at pace. Every year, there's a report that's published by the LSE Grantham Research Institute, which highlights the trends in climate-related litigation. The latest report, published in the summer, highlighted the increase in the number of jurisdictions where there are climate change cases, the increase in litigation against corporates as well as governments, and that high-emitting projects are more likely to be challenged at different points in their life cycle than previously. And there's litigation concerning investment decisions. Now, most carbon-intensive industries are still looking to grow their business, despite the clear messages that we need oil and gas to stay in the ground if we are to have a hope of keeping within that 1.5-degree target. With the news in the UK a couple of weeks ago on the further exploration and drilling of North Sea oil fields, it seems to me there is much to be done. Litigation will continue and is having an impact, but it can be slow and expensive. So we need a variety of tactics. Now, earlier on, I promised you some insights into a couple of legal developments that you may not be aware of. There are 2 points I wanted to raise here. Firstly, the new EU directives on green claims and the progress on due diligence laws. And secondly, a recent development on business and human rights. So there are a couple of complementary proposals at the moment for directives. There's the proposal for a directive on green claims, and there's a directive on empowering consumers for the green transition. They're going to introduce more requirements and rigor to making green claims, allowing companies to manage the related risks better. Companies are going to have to substantiate their environmental claims before they publish them. They will need to produce evidence to back them up, and there will be a need for independent verification. Earlier, I was talking of the risks of climate change to business. But climate change is not only an issue of material, financial, and systemic risk for corporates, financial institutions, and investors. There is also the question of impacts that those businesses and those investors having on the environment. And a part of this is the responsibility of business enterprises to respect human rights. In the European Union, there is soon to be a cross-sectoral due diligence law, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, CSDDD, as we call it. It draws on the UN guiding principles on business and human rights and the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. Now, the final text is still subject to ongoing negotiations, but the legislation will require companies operating on the EU market to identify, bring to an end, prevent, mitigate, and account for negative human rights and environmental impacts of the company's operations, their subsidiaries, their value chains. And companies, large companies, will also need to have a transition plan in place in line with the Paris Agreement. Some of you may be aware of the due diligence laws in Europe, the French duty of vigilance law, which requires companies to produce and implement a vigilance plan. There are lots of these laws in different countries, and people are beginning to look at them and think about what it means to actually comply. And so with some partners, we issued legal warnings to 9 French companies in connection with the French duty of vigilance law. Those companies included Danone, Nestlé France, McDonald's France, and several supermarkets. And the concern related to them inadequately addressing the risks relating to the plastic pollution that they produce. Subsequently, we and our partners are taking Danone to court. That case is ongoing, so watch this space. And then in 2021, ClientEarth filed a legal complaint accusing Saudi Aramco of the largest ever climate-related breach of international human rights law by a business. And crucially for all of you, the complaint also named the company's key financial supporters. And they include Citigroup, HSBC, JP Morgan Chase. The complaint being that they had facilitated the company's impact on people and the environment. Aramco is the world's single biggest corporate emitter, and yet it plans to sustain its massive fossil fuel production and sales through the energy transition and look for even more reserves. And in August this year, the United Nations warned Aramco and its financiers over their role in driving climate-fueled human rights violations because of the company's outsized contribution to the climate crisis. In a communication to the company, the UN experts expressed concern about how the oil giants' actions contribute to undermining the Paris Agreement because of the existential threat to human rights posed by climate change. And they also said that the involvement of the financial institutions in financing that company could be in violation of international human rights law and standards. It is the first time that UN experts have taken action about an oil major's human rights responsibilities for climate change. People in every country, on every continent, are being affected by climate change. And it has now been acknowledged that carbon-intensive industries are driving climate catastrophe across our planet. And at the same time, the banks and the financial institutions are supporting those harmful activities because they are continuing to enable fossil fuel expansion plans. Luckily for financial market participants, the implications of their responsibilities are in many cases similar to the steps they should be taking anyway. The things they should be doing to manage the systemic risk posed by climate change in line with legal duties. They should, at the very least, be using their leverage over the corporates in question to prevent and mitigate those adverse impacts. Or where a financier is actually facilitating environmental harms, they must stop contributing to those human rights abuses by ceasing to provide further funding, and must use their leverage to mitigate the remaining impact to the greatest extent possible. So in short, where finance is provided to environmentally harmful activities, those providing the finance have a responsibility to prevent and mitigate adverse impacts from taking place. That might include exclusions, or once adverse impacts have been identified, it might include robust engagement, use of voting rights, that sort of thing. So what can all of us do? Let's come back to that question. Well, it seems to me that we can ask the difficult questions of those companies we or our clients are investing in. We can use the tools of stewardship to engage with investee companies and use our vote to challenge behaviour. We can use our voice in consultations and government calls for evidence. If we're pension members, we can raise issues with our pension trustees. We need to realise and act on these environmental challenges because of the financial implications, the impact for our economy, and those impacts that are going to be felt by future generations. That should be concerning you and me now, today. So as I said a few moments ago, all of us will be impacted by climate change and biodiversity loss. So let's not stand around letting it happen to us. Let's take responsibility for what we as individuals, as professional advisors, as citizens can do. Let's ask the difficult questions. Let's use our stewardship tools, and let's make a difference. Thank you very much. I'm nervously staying here, Julia, because I thought I might be...
Yeah, but let's stay for a moment asking questions. Anyone can ask questions except Mike, just saying.
Sorry, Mike. Okay, I don't really mean it.
So can I just start off by saying, isn't it amazing that we've got a bunch of lawyers who are actually doing this stuff at all? Isn't that, to me, that's just brilliant. So,
thank you.
Thank you for what you do. So, questions, gentleman at the front.
Thank you. Hello, good afternoon. Shabir Razvi from International Finance Solutions Associates. Thank you very much for a very enlightening, informative, and passionate presentation. My question really is that we talk about sort of carbon mitigation, fossil fuel, and so on. Have we ever thought in our sort of investment and financial sort of strategies, particularly as a lawyer, that how intensive is war, the impact of what's happening in Afghanistan, in Syria, in Libya, in Ukraine, the 2 atomic bombs in Japan, what sort of carbon impact that has had. No one has ever thought about it. No one sort of tries to sort of not invest in the armament industries because they give a good return. Perhaps it's something that we should be thinking very seriously, that the carbon impact of war, not just fossil fuels.
Shall I just jump in and say quickly, in defence of our entire industry, I'm guessing you're not that close to it. Quite a lot of us think about that quite a lot. It matters, right? You may have seen our lovely new Defence Secretary saying that the ESG community was a threat to the UK. It's just ridiculous. Clearly the share values are going up through the roof. They are not struggling for capital. And there's just umpteen reasons why most funds do not invest in them. That will be one of them. But
I mean, that was one of the things I was going to say, actually, is that many investment products already exclude anything that could be like that. I suppose the only other thing I was going to say was actually, I see climate change as a risk multiplier. And actually, my concern, or part of the concern, is that if we don't act soon, we're going to have more of those issues. There will be more unrest, and there will be more concerns. I mean, if you look at a map and work out which countries are going to be impacted by climate change, it's basically everyone, and everyone's going to have to move from where they are at the moment, and you're going to have this huge migration issue.
Yes.
And then that leads to a whole load of food scarcity as well, and so it is an issue that we need to be facing.
It makes it almost comical that people are talking about, oh, well, gosh, there's thousands of people trying to get into the UK. I mean, what's going to happen? You go plus 3 degrees C. Those numbers just will be child's play. So yeah. Can I see if there are any other questions? Lady here in the white jacket, and then Cleona afterwards. If someone could get a mic to Cleona as well, please.
Thank you so much for a really passionate talk there. Surely, if the problem is as severe as you suggest, and I'm not disagreeing, we should try and focus our efforts on the areas that are the greatest offenders per se. Saudi Aramco is now listed, and therefore it's within scope. To what extent is it true that actually, or better question actually, how can we access those who are even greater offenders, the sovereign wealths, those who are out of scope because they haven't got a listed structure per se? What should we do about that, please?
Well, that's a challenging question, isn't it?
Yeah,
I mean, Julia's going to answer my questions.
I'll ask if Mylin's still here. If Mylin's still around, I feel quite sure Mylin will have an answer, and there may be fund managers who do, because presumably they do still need capital on occasions despite their immense wealth. And Mike will probably pick up on it too by the looks of it. But
oh, fabulous. Thanks, Mike.
Yes.
I was also going to say, actually, we do really need to be very careful that we're not just thinking about equities, but actually thinking about the bonds market, because most of the industries that are most concerned about actually are getting most of their money through debt. So it is a question, I suppose, of thinking about the whole system and quite what we can do within the whole system. So, I mean, as lawyers, we have legal levers and we use those where we can, but it's a question of which, what powers we have and what opportunities there are to do things, and some of the places are harder to attack.
But when we were hearing earlier about the opportunity for action amongst sovereigns, for investors who've got those relationships with those sovereigns to start pulling levers that were previously overlooked, I think it's going to be a really interesting area over the next 5-10 years. That's probably one of the biggest growth areas I see. So here's to hoping, right? Any further questions that we might actually be able to answer? Cleona, please, go ahead.
Is it on? Thank you, Joanne. I'm really touched by your work about the fact that you're using systems, because this is a systemic issue. We can feel individual guilt and recycle and, worm compost till the cows come home, but it's not going to make a collective difference. I was wondering, I came across the work of Polly Higgins, and I attended a talk by her. She's a barrister. She passed away, unfortunately. But her dream was to pass a law for the earth called ecocide, an international law. I was wondering what your thoughts are about the possibility of such a thing, and if you're familiar with her work. And
Oh goodness, I have to say, ecocide is always a really difficult issue, isn't it? So I'm not sure what to say at this moment.
So anyone who thinks that there aren't advisors who care or understand about these issues, please recognise how corrected you are, because that is obviously such a massive issue. And yeah.
Apologies, I have to say that given my practice and given the area that I work in, I can't really comment particularly on ecocide. There are many other people who would be in a position to do so, but I think it's probably better for me not to say anything than to just launch in with something off the cuff.
Yeah. We know lots of things, but not that one perhaps, or the previous two for that matter.
I knew I didn't want the questions bit.
Yes. So any other questions? The lady here in the white jacket. Yep. Oh, and over here.
Oh
sorry.
my goodness.
I've got the microphone, so...
Yes,
Oh, well, you have the power then.
Possessions 9/10, yes.
We had James Alexander from UK SIF speaking earlier, and one of the points he mentioned that he was lobbying on was for clarity on fiduciary duty, and whether or not that needs to account for something other than financial return. If that did change, this comes very much from a point of not understanding the law, would that change your ability to do more in this, or is it not a legal framework in that respect?
No, I mean, I think it would be tremendously helpful, to be honest, because there has been a lot of confusion over what fiduciaries are really focused on and whether it's only purely about about monetary return. And that's been something that has been interesting within the pension space that I'm quite familiar with, and I think the wider space as well. So yes, it would be helpful if we had a bit more clarity and the law on fiduciary duties was amended. That would be great, I would say.
Thank you. Can I take one question here, and then Seb at the back, and then we're going to close this session.
Hi, everyone. Bit of a hijack, really, because I'm also with ClientEarth. I work in our philanthropy team, and I just wanted to reiterate that, as Joe said at the start, we are a not-for-profit organisation. We are a registered charity, and all of the amazing work that our lawyers like Joe are able to do is through donations and grants. So if you have any inclination to learn more about how your company could support ClientEarth, how you personally could support ClientEarth, I'd be really bad at my job if I wasn't saying this to this room. So I'll be around at the end. Please do come and find me, or you can look us up on our website. We have lots of newsletters where you can keep up to date. Sorry, I just wanted to shoehorn that into the end.
Yes, and I should have said that at the start. I would say my £10 a month probably doesn't go very far, but if we all did £10 a month, then presumably that helps. That can get
Thank
somewhere,
you.
hopefully.
Yeah, thank you so much for those who support. Yeah, absolutely.
So, but yes, fab work. One final question at the back, please, and then we're going to close this session.
Thank you. Huge fan of your work up there. I think it's brilliant. I just wanted to pick up on that question about fiduciary duty. Have you thought about, and actually link it to the next section, which is about what the actuaries are going to say, because in July, the Institute of Actuaries released a report called The Emperor's New Climate Scenarios, which spells out in no uncertain terms what that climate risk is a financial risk. I think that has a huge impact on fiduciary duty as the law already stands. Have you got any opinions on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think to some extent the law is already clear. And actually, if people were to act in accordance with the current law, a lot of these issues would be dealt with. But I think, there's still uncertainty, so clarity, and often, we've seen clarity on some of the pensions regulations and that sort of thing. I actually don't think that some of those things changed the law. I actually just think they clarified and helped people to feel safe to do some things that they could do anyway. But I don't know if that answers your question, but I think some of these things were already quite clear. But people, I suppose it depends whether people are trying to use the law as a shield or a sword, doesn't it? And some people are trying to protect themselves from doing certain things. Sometimes a change can help, and it gives people the power and the sort of the ability to do what they wanted to do anyway, and they probably could have done.
Thank you. Can I ask you to all thank Joe one more time? And thank you. That was really good. That was really good.